When the latest batch of documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein began circulating online, most people expected what they had already seen before: lists of names, financial movements, and fragments of a story that never quite feels complete. But this time, something smaller caught attention first. Not a headline name, not a major revelation, but a single label tied to a financial record. It was simple, almost easy to overlook, yet it stood out enough that people paused. The label read BAL. At face value, it could mean anything: an abbreviation, a placeholder, a routine internal tag. But in a case where every detail has been examined repeatedly for years, even something this small became a point of focus. People began sharing screenshots, circling the name, comparing it to other entries, asking whether it appeared elsewhere. What made it unusual wasn't just the label itself, but the timing. It appeared in documents released during a period when public attention had already returned to the case, meaning anything new, no matter how minor, was instantly amplified. As discussion spread, interpretations followed. Some saw coincidence, others saw intention. And while no clear explanation was confirmed, the effect was the same. It reopened curiosity around a case many believed had already revealed most of what it could. Instead of closure, it created momentum again. Because in stories like this, it's rarely the biggest details that keep people watching. It's the smallest ones that don't quite make sense, the ones that linger just long enough to make people ask whether they're looking at something ordinary or something that only appears that way at first glance. As more records surfaced, the focus shifted beyond individual details and toward the broader picture forming around them. Each release didn't just add information, it reshaped how people interpreted everything that came before. Financial documents, flight logs, contact lists, and correspondence all began to overlap in ways that felt increasingly complex. It became less about any single piece of evidence and more about how those pieces connected. Observers started mapping timelines, comparing names, identifying patterns in movement and communication. What stood out wasn't necessarily what was proven, but what appeared consistent. The same circles, the same environments, the same types of interactions, repeating over time. This is what turned the case from a single narrative into something much larger in the public mind. Because instead of asking what happened, people began asking how something like this could exist for so long without being fully exposed earlier. The documents didn't provide a complete answer, but they hinted at a structure, one that extended beyond a single individual. And once that idea took hold, every new file became more than just information. It became part of a puzzle people felt compelled to solve. The more they looked, the more they realized that understanding the situation wasn't about finding one missing piece. It was about understanding how all the visible pieces fit together, and why some still seemed to be missing entirely. As attention deepened, another layer began drawing interest, this time not from numbers or names, but from language. Certain communications included wording that, on the surface, seemed completely ordinary, everyday terms, casual phrasing, nothing that would stand out in isolation. But when placed in context and examined collectively, some readers felt the tone and repetition were unusual enough to question. Discussions began forming around whether these patterns meant anything at all or whether they were simply being overanalyzed. It's important to note that no official confirmation has established hidden meanings behind these phrases. Still, the conversation itself became part of the story. Because in situations where trust has already been eroded, even normal details can start to feel unclear. The human tendency to search for patterns takes over, especially when dealing with incomplete information. What might otherwise be dismissed quickly instead becomes something people revisit repeatedly, comparing interpretations and debating possibilities. This dynamic doesn't necessarily prove anything on its own, but it reveals how the narrative has evolved. The focus is no longer just on what is known, but on what might be implied, what might be hidden, and what might only become clear when viewed from a different angle. And that shift, from certainty to interpretation, is what keeps people engaged, even when definitive answers remain out of reach. Over time, the discussion moved away from isolated details and toward a broader, more difficult question. Was this ever about just one person? Journalists, researchers, and commentators began emphasizing that focusing only on Epstein might overlook the larger structure surrounding him. The idea isn't new, but it gained traction again as more information surfaced. Because when patterns appear across different areas, finance, travel, communication, it suggests coordination rather than coincidence. This is where the concept of networks becomes central, not in a speculative sense, but in a structural one. Large systems, especially those involving influence and access, rarely operate in isolation. They depend on connections, on mutual benefit, on roles that support one another. If Epstein had access to powerful individuals across multiple industries, the question naturally becomes how that access was maintained and why it continued for as long as it did. These are not easy questions to answer, and the available information doesn't fully resolve them. But they change the way people interpret everything else. Because once you consider the possibility of a broader system, individual details take on new meaning. They are no longer just events. They are potential indicators of something more organized, more persistent, and more complex than it first appeared. Amid all the analysis, speculation, and document breakdowns, there's another part of the story that remains essential: the experiences of those directly affected. Accounts from individuals connected to the case often describe a progression that doesn't begin with anything obviously alarming. Instead, it starts with opportunity: financial help, introductions, access to environments that seem promising or beneficial. Over time, those opportunities can shift into something more controlling, creating situations where leaving becomes difficult. This dynamic is critical to understanding how influence operates in these contexts. It's not always immediate or visible. It develops gradually, often in ways that are hard to recognize until much later. And while documents and records provide structure to the story, these personal accounts provide context. They explain how systems function on an individual level, how power is experienced, rather than just observed. Without this perspective, the narrative risks becoming abstract, reduced to names and numbers without understanding the impact behind them. Including it doesn't just add depth, it changes the focus. It reminds viewers that beyond the complexity and the unanswered questions, there are real consequences tied to everything being discussed. After years of investigations, document releases, interviews, and public debate, one question refuses to disappear. No matter how many files are analyzed, no matter how many timelines are built, it keeps coming back in a slightly different form. If so much has already been exposed, why does the story still feel unfinished? Why does every new detail seem to open another door instead of closing one? It creates a strange kind of loop where information doesn't lead to resolution, but instead leads to more uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what keeps people watching, reading, and questioning. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, what stands out isn't just what is known, it's what isn't. The gaps, the missing context, the moments where something should connect clearly but doesn't. Those gaps become impossible to ignore over time. They make people wonder whether the available information represents the full reality or just a portion of it. And in cases like this, partial visibility can be more unsettling than having no information at all, because it gives the impression that something is there, just out of reach. There's also the question of timing. Why do certain details emerge years later instead of all at once? Why do some pieces gain attention immediately while others go unnoticed until someone looks closer? Information doesn't exist in a vacuum. It moves through systems, legal systems, media cycles, public attention, and each of those layers affects what is seen, when it is seen, and how it is interpreted. That means the story people are trying to understand isn't just shaped by facts, but by how and when those facts are revealed. And then there's the bigger issue that sits underneath everything else. Even if every document were released, even if every connection were mapped out perfectly, would that actually answer the most important questions? Or would it simply confirm that the structure behind it was more complex than anyone expected? Because complexity doesn't always lead to clarity. Sometimes it does the opposite. It makes it harder to separate what matters from what doesn't, harder to understand cause and effect, harder to know where the story truly begins and ends. That's why this situation continues to hold attention long after the initial headlines faded. It isn't just about one person or one set of events. It's about the possibility that what has already been revealed is only part of something larger, something that doesn't fit neatly into a single explanation. And as long as that possibility exists, the conversation stays alive. People continue to revisit the same details, not because they haven't seen them before, but because they're trying to see them differently, hoping that a new perspective might finally make everything click. But maybe that moment never comes. Maybe the reason this story feels incomplete is because it is. Not in the sense that something obvious is missing, but in the sense that some things are never fully uncovered, never fully explained, never fully resolved in a way that satisfies everyone looking at them. And if that's the case, then the search for a final answer might be the one thing that keeps the story going indefinitely. So the real question might not be what happened, it might be how much of it will ever be fully understood, and more importantly, how much of it was never meant to be.